Thank you all so much for joining us here today at the Center for Global Development for the first of our UN Secretary General Candidates Forums. We are very pleased to be co-hosting with the American University School of International Service and the Stimson Center. I'm Beth Schwanke. I'm CGD's Director of Policy Outreach and Senior Policy Counsel. So my colleagues here at CGD have been very vocal about the need for more transparency in the leadership selection processes of our multilateral institutions. We've previously hosted public forums and debates for the candidates for the presidency of the World Bank, the regional development banks, and so we're very pleased to be doing so today for the Secretary General candidates. And we hope that it can play a small role in pushing future selection processes towards more openness. We have invited each of the Secretary General candidates to join us for a public forum and hope to host them all, including one new candidate as of a few hours ago. And we'll have to host them all quite quickly before what I have heard referred to as this year's other election. So today we will hear from Vuk Jeremić on his vision for the role and the institution going forward. In the fifth straw poll taken on Monday, Mr. Jeremić was in second place, according to results released on Twitter. And the Security Council will conduct its final vote on October 5th to nominate one candidate for confirmation by the General Assembly later this year. So we want to leave a majority of our time for audience questions. So let me briefly introduce everyone, and then we'll get started. Mr. Jeremić served as Foreign Minister of Serbia from 2007 to 2012 and was elected President of the UN General Assembly from 2012 to 2013. He's currently President of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development. And Mr. Jeremić, I was interested to see your platform for your candidacy, and I think something 53 commitments, and I believe you're actually the only candidate who has released a public platform. So you should all definitely check that out. And joining Mr. Jeremić today, we have Tammy Gutner, who is an associate professor at American School of International Service, Bill Dirch, distinguished fellow at Stimson's Future of Peace Operations program, and Charles Kenny, senior fellow here at the Center for Global Development. So we'll plan to first hear from Mr. Jeremić on his vision, and then I will turn it over to our hosts for 2 rounds of questions each, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So Mr. Jeremić, we would love to hear from you on your vision.
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's a great privilege to be here. I want to thank not just the Center for Global Development, but also Stimson and the American University School of International Service. Thank you very much all for coming. It's really exciting thing to talk about the future of the United Nations and the election process in public. It hasn't happened all that often until now. It is happening right now. Since you're all here, I guess you're interested in foreign affairs and what's going on in the world, and therefore I don't have to tell you that we live in transformational times, in very turbulent times, and that the world is changing at a very, very fast pace, that the changes are perhaps unprecedented in scope and certainly pace, and that the challenges that humanity is facing in the 21st century, the main challenges at least, are invariably global in their nature. And therefore it is very, very difficult to imagine how to address these challenges outside common framework to cooperate, multilateral framework for cooperation. And for better or for worse, we have only one institution that has universal membership, comprehensive legitimacy, and that is the United Nations. And whilst being far from perfect an institution, it is the only platform that we currently have, and the only platform that we're likely to have in this generation. But not all is well at the UN. I spent 1 year there, so I don't have vast UN experience, but I was elected president of the UN General Assembly. I did see how things work and look from the inside. Not all is well there. And I believe that the pace of change in the United Nations is actually far lower than the pace of change in the world. So there's a growing gap. And I believe that unless we find a way to rejuvenate the institution, if we don't find a way to recapture the trust and imagination of humanity, we might end up in a situation in which this organization just remains remembered as a great peace project of the 20th century. And when I was part of hearings, unprecedented hearings in the General Assembly earlier this year, in answering one of the questions I said, because they asked me about change time and again, and I said, look, if you believe that the organization is moving in the right direction and at the right pace, then I'm not your guy. If you believe that there are things to be done and that we need to change this organization so that we can make it fit for purpose, to be able to address the challenges of humanity in the 21st century, here's how I intend to do it. Here are 53 things that I propose that we do it together so that we make the UN fit for purpose again. It's a great pleasure that I'm here, and I'd be very happy to answer your questions with regard to the UN, what's going on in the world, election process, or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you. And this might be the first diplomat that has actually stuck to our timeline, so thank you. All right, Tammy, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. It's really exciting to be here. My question is actually a three-part question. Your 53 commitments are very ambitious and also very concrete, which a lot of people will be very pleased to see. But to implement them all, which you say you'd like to do on day one, will be very expensive. So my question is, what is your strategy for organizing the resources that might be necessary to implement such ambitious ideas? And related to that, you'll no doubt encounter obstacles. What are the main obstacles you might expect, and how would you address them?
So I was actually very carefully structuring these commitments so that they are, in my view, realistic. Some of them are difficult to implement, I agree, but I think that all of them are realistic. When it comes to increase in budget, which is always a very tricky question, not just in the UN, it's anywhere you go in the world, it's an issue. When it comes to public domain, at least. There's only one significant increase in spending that I propose, and this is the increase in the budget of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which I believe generally that the human rights machinery of the United Nations is chronically under-resourced. And this is the only increase that I'm proposing. But I'm not proposing an overall increase in member states' contributions. This is basically down to the member states to decide. They're doing it in the fifth committee, financial committee, and trust me, this is one of the most notoriously difficult organs of the United Nations, the fifth committee. It's up to them to decide what would be their contributions, their level contributions, and so on and so forth. But I think that it is possible, at least when it comes to what is done to Secretary General, and this is the resources of the Secretariat. I think it is possible to cut waste and to make it more efficient. And some of the concrete proposals that I make are aimed at increased efficiency and transparency. I think we could do a better job when it comes to fighting corruption in the UN. This is also related to resources. One of the things that I propose in my platform is that absolute prerequisite for making a high-level appointment, those appointments that the Secretary General makes, is going to be to make a public financial disclosure. Believe it or not, that's not mandatory in the United Nations. If you want to run for City Hall, you've got to do it, but not if you want to go for a high-level post in the UN. Well, if I become Secretary General, that is going to become mandatory. I also propose that we strengthen and make it independent, the Office of Internal Oversight, which so far has not been the case. So to have more of a Inspector General type of institution led by a prominent international figure that is not going to be bossed around by anybody, including Secretary General. So these are some of the proposals that I make. There are some strategic proposals to do with the new generation of peacekeeping, but I believe that we're going to get there in more detail very quickly. But then again, this club, this organization, belongs first and foremost to the member states. So Secretary General has to be aware of the fact that he is there to lead, but also to serve the member states. So it will have to be a decision of the member states, especially when it comes to tricky things like budget and contributions.
Bill.
Okay. Was looking through your vision statement this morning. Excellent. I'm glad to see that effort made. And you're advocating more robust peace operations by the UN, and especially operations in the Middle East and North Africa region. So there's an argument that's made that the UN is heavily engaged in sub-Saharan Africa and not the Middle East, because the veto-wielding members of the Security Council do not have vital interests in southern Africa, but they do have vital interests in the Middle East. So how would you, as Secretary General, first overcome political barriers to creating and deploying operations in that area, should it be decided that they're needed? And then secondly, how, because there's no complex operations ever been deployed there, how would you overcome local opposition and develop consent to UN deployment, unless you foresee somehow the UN deploying without local consent?
Well, now we're talking about one of the more, some people would say, controversial parts of my platform, because issues related to peace and security are first and foremost dealt by the Security Council, which these days is a difficult place, and perhaps a forum where some of the political or geopolitical frictions and divisions are most manifest. But if you look at the peace and security challenges that we face in the 21st century, I think that, I mean, with violence, extremism, with cyber, and so on and so forth, I think one has to say it openly. The current machinery, the current peace operations, the current capacities that the UN has are nowhere near what one needs if one wants to keep the UN active or relevant in the field of peace and security. We see some of the operations that you mentioned in Africa. There's a South Sudan operation in which there's a tricky situation there, and the troops have not been very active, let me say, in confronting the challenges in fulfilling the mandate given to them by a Security Council resolution. Now imagine those guys and those troops and under such command and under such rules of engagement in a place like Libya or Yemen, or let alone Syria, tomorrow after hopefully a peace deal is made by the key actors and confirmed by the Security Council. So this is why I'm proposing that and it's not going to happen overnight, but you got to start somewhere, to build a new generation of peace stabilization missions. Not only peacekeeping missions, but peace stabilization missions that would have much more robust rules of engagement. And that is going to require lots of discussions and lots of diplomacy with both troop contributing countries and police contributing countries on one side, and those who would have to make up for the gap in the current UN capacity and what we're hoping to have. Those troops, those missions would have much more robust rules of engagement, but also much better intelligence sharing and reaching out on the air and sea capacity of member states, together with an increased and enhanced political function of political officers that would be part of such missions. Now, you can deploy such troops without Security Council decision. it is not possible to deploy UN troops. These ones that we have today, or the ones of the future that I hope we're going to be able to put together. And there comes the issue of how deeply you envisage or you want to have Secretary General involved in diplomatic disputes or geopolitical divisions. I think that we could have done better. And I think that the Secretary General could have been more agile in asserting himself or herself in the future in the discussions about the key hotspots of the day. He or she is not going to be able to deliver miracles, but he or she could choose to be very agile, forward-leaning, and loud, if need be, about what's going on, what needs to be done, and perhaps be a little bit more energetic when it comes to convening parties around the table and helping them come to an agreement. Again, this is not from like fairy tales. We don't live in such a world, and the big powers tend to be difficult to work with, but the Secretary General has a capacity to do things if he or she chooses to do so. I intend to be such Secretary General if elected.
Thank you. It is great to have you here in a week where in Washington we just appointed a new head of an international organization, and as per usual there was no real debate and only a candidate from one country had any hope at all. It's nice to see the contrast at the UN where there really is an active discussion involving plausible nominees from many different countries. So thank you very much for that. My question is, first question is around the Sustainable Development Goals. You highlight the SDGs and say that you would champion them. It's been a year since they were agreed at the UN, and that it was an amazing moment when the world came together and said we were going to wipe out poverty and we were going to wipe out most major diseases and we were going to make sure everybody had sanitation and so on by 2030. I have to say, while it was a lovely moment, since then there has been almost no policy change as a result of the Sustainable Development Goals, and given that they demand unprecedented historical progress, we should be seeing massive policy change if we're to have any hope of meeting them. Is there any plausible role for the Secretary General to get that policy change moving, or is it something where the best you can do is sort of cheerlead from a distance?
Well, actually, I start off my platform with sustainable development. I really believe this is the overarching challenge for humanity in this generation. I'm very proud that I did play a part in the process that ended up with the adoption of the Agenda 2030. It was in the 67th session of the General Assembly that we started off negotiations. It looked back at the time as an impossible task, but we ended up having it. And I agree, it's a great piece of paper, perhaps a little long piece of paper, but a good piece of paper. I think this is one of the two big breakthroughs of last year, the other one being the COP21, the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, the question of implementation. If there is no decisive leadership of the United Nations, and the United Nations, although it's a very big and complex institution, it is in many ways personified by the Secretary General. If there is no decisive political push by the Secretary General himself or herself when it comes to implementing SDGs and making sure that there are annual reviews and that they are done at the regional level, and that the countries are assisted in reaching the goals. The UN has a vast network array of country offices and country teams. What I propose is that we should put fulfilling of SDGs central to UN agenda, including all its country teams. So in places where there is an issue of capacity or ability or the need for getting the direction right. This is where I think the UN can practically help with the expertise and otherwise. But the role of the Secretary General is to basically tune the organization so that it does have at its very heart this long-term picture, because we're always going to have crisis. We live in such times that I'd love to be wrong, but it's difficult to imagine a week or a month without crisis, and that's not going to get that much better anytime soon. But this doesn't mean that we can afford to just do the firefighting as a UN. We have to have a comprehensive vision. And since countries are coming from different geographies and different backgrounds and different cultures, the only one place where it can all come together and make somehow sense is the United Nations. So there is a huge role for the Secretary General, and I intend to devote most of my personal energy and attention to it.
Okay, next round of questions, and I'm going to urge everyone to be very brief so that we can get to audience questions.
Thank you. Mr. Jeremić, one of the perennial problems facing the UN is its sprawling bureaucracy. Can you give some examples from your past career, maybe focusing on the General Assembly, of specific initiatives you've taken to address such a problem?
I did face bureaucracy in the UN. I did face bureaucracy in the government when I was minister. And I don't think that I'm going to, reveal a big secret if I say that bureaucracies tend to be very opposed to any kind of reform and change of itself. So every time that you are faced with bureaucracy as an outsider who wants to get things done more quickly or in a different way from which they believe it has to be done, then you're faced with serious resistance. Recently, there was a poll of UN staff as to who would they like to see as Secretary General. I came last. And that really gave me a boost. That really made me believe that the concrete proposals that I make actually make some sense, because the bureaucracy would be instinctively against what you are trying to do. It is a big beast, and it's not going to be easy, and we could spend probably a lot of time talking about it. But I'd be happy to get into more details at another occasion. But Chief Administrative Officer, this is one of the most important roles for the Secretary General. And out of those 53 commitments that I make, a lot of them are to do with the cutting waste and tackling bureaucracy. I intend to devote my first 100 days to that so that my credibility is enhanced, so that I can then approach other, possibly external issues with a higher degree of credibility.
Okay, Bill.
Okay. Mr. Jeremić, I would be very interested to hear your views on the UN's appropriate role in post-conflict transitional justice, to include the roles of international or hybrid national international courts to deal with such things as war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide.
Actually, I think the developments of these days and weeks, particularly in Syria, remind us that we live in dangerous times when the scourge of mass atrocities and genocide is very much with us, so that the cry never again is not something that we can say has been fulfilled and assured. And this is why a number of my proposals in the platform actually relate to the enhancing of this issue as a priority for the Secretary General. For example, I propose that we create a special task force chaired by the Secretary General that would meet monthly. That would be task force to prevent mass atrocity, genocide and other mass atrocities, that would be comprised of Secretary General as advisor for the responsibility to protect, several other bodies and entities to be represented there that would have the early prevention role. When it comes to international criminal justice, it's a very tricky topic, it's a very delicate topic, especially in certain parts of the world like Africa. A lot of African nations are expressing their concerns with those courts, in particular ICC. Myself personally, I'm a supporter of international criminal justice, and I think that whilst imperfect, like most things in life are, it's an important tool of maintaining peace, stability, and assuring prosperity in the future. If I become Secretary General, I intend to work closely with international criminal courts and other judicial organs, because I believe that their role, especially in the post-transition societies, is critical. I come from a part of the world that has its share of problems and has its share of difficulties with international tribunals. I think we've learned a number of lessons from it. And I think that my own personal experience can be somehow used to advance the cause of international justice. Having courts, international courts, including the ICC, actually starting with the ICC, is a foremost tool in making sure that there is sustained peace and stability.
And Charles, final question.
As you know, many people think it's about time we had a woman Secretary General, and I think that's not just because of the symbolism, it's because the UN has a problem when it comes to women. If you look at peacekeeping, about 4% of peacekeepers are women. If you look at the allegations of sexual misconduct in peacekeeping operations, they are quite scary. If you look at senior management in the United Nations, the percentage that are women has been dropping over the last few years and is only about 1/5 today. What could you do to demonstrate, if you were to become Secretary General, that there was a feminist as Secretary General in the next period?
Yeah, a lot of people did speak about the fact that the time has come for a woman to be Secretary General. And I would phrase this slightly differently. I think that this election has certainly needs to be a defining moment for the role of women in the UN and for women protection and gender equality in general. So come what may, whoever ends up winning, I think that this has to be a turning point. And if I happen to be the person who will lead the UN as of January 1, one of my commitments was that I have a 50% parity in all USG appointments. USG stands for Undersecretary General in this context. There are 88 Undersecretary Generals, and only a third are women. Well, because the Undersecretary General resigned together with the Secretary General, and there basically has to be a reappointment of all Undersecretary Generals. The new Secretary General will have a chance to do something about gender equality. Of course, he or she will have to make sure that the competent people who are appointed and so on and so forth, he or she will have to make sure that there is a right geographic balance so that all parts of the world are equally represented. But one of my commitments, and I'm very firm about this commitment, is that there's going to be a day one 50-50 gender parity when it comes to Undersecretary Generals. And then my 5-year horizon is to make it happen throughout the system so that we have a gender parity throughout the system. But I start off by senior appointments and, in a way, lead by example in that sense. But it's not only about numbers. I think it's also about quality of opportunity and quality of career service in the UN and in general. And therefore, in my platform, I propose an overhaul in how we measure how well we're doing on issue of gender equality. For example, one of the most important, believe it or not, one of the most important matrices is how many times the word woman is mentioned in UN resolutions. And then if it's like a super high number of times that the word woman is mentioned, then we feel good about ourselves and say like, yeah, we're doing something. Well, I would actually instruct the system to come under the leadership of UN Women to devise a new matrix in which we are going to, according to which we are going to evaluate how well we are doing. When it comes to peacekeeping, I propose a new trust fund to enhance participation of women in peace operations. Again, this would have to be a voluntary fund because I am not proposing increased expenditures. I'm not proposing this by member states. Member states will have to decide it themselves, but I will create a trust fund with the aim of incentivizing troop contributing countries and police contributing countries to have more women by having special training, by giving them other kinds of incentives. But I believe it's only 4% and it's intolerably low. I think we can and we should do better.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining us, and please feel free to take your seats down there. And we're going to go ahead and open it to audience questions. I'm going to gather about 3 at a time so that we can do several rounds. So if folks would just raise your hands and we'll go ahead. All right, right here in the front, please. There's a microphone coming. So.
Thank you, Mr. Jeremić. To become Secretary General, you have to get through the Security Council, and that means getting through the United States. And it seems that the United States is going to be apprehensive to your nomination because of your stance on the Kosovo issue. So do you think that that with the time that has passed since you were an official in the Serbian government, that you can overcome the Kosovo issue that has caused apprehension in the United States and other countries?
Okay, great. And now I will take 2 more questions. Yes, sir, right back there in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. In this day and age with a number of global issues and considering this very detailed 50-point plan that you put out for Secretary General, what do you see as the biggest threat or challenge that the United Nations should attempt to address or discuss, and how would you approach that challenge should you become the next Secretary General?
Okay, and one more question. Yes, all the way there in the back.
Thank you for coming today, sir. Considering the rising tensions recently between the United States and the Russian Federation in the conflict towards Syria, how would you propose bringing these 2 polar countries together to the negotiation table when it comes to the Syrian conflict with their new rising tensions and their polarization and policy within themselves?
Okay, Mr. Jeremić, Kosovo, the biggest challenge is Syria, maybe one of the biggest challenges. Take your pick, and then we'll take another round.
The first part of the question related to the United States vote. P5, any of the P5, they do not reveal how they vote. So it's very difficult to speculate on how they're going to vote. Sometimes people get surprised by how people vote on certain issues, especially when the vote is secret. Now, on the issue of Kosovo, I did serve as a Serbian foreign minister in a very tricky period, 2007 to 2012. And right then, 2008, Kosovo unilaterally declared independence. And I was at the time the youngest foreign minister in the world. And as a matter of fact, I don't think that I would have even become a foreign minister had anybody else wanted the job at the time, because everybody thought that this was going to be a disastrously difficult period, and certainly not something that anybody can be successful, or not for a very long time. But now with the benefit of hindsight, I think that one can say that this was the very first time in the history of the Balkans that nobody died over an issue of such gravity. And the history of the Balkans is a tricky history. And this time around, a very, very significant disagreement was dealt by in a highly peaceful, civilized, and diplomatic way. And I think this should be the role of diplomacy, not to convince somebody that he or she is wrong and that he or she should accept your opinion, but to be able to actually work with people despite disagreements that you might have. So I think that if one looks back, this episode is a successful exercise in diplomacy, given that zero casualties, zero fatalities in a place like the Balkans were encountered. There are still different views on Kosovo. And this is seen in the Security Council every time that the Security Council convenes and discusses Kosovo. Secretary General, according to the Security Council Resolution 1244, which is the pertinent resolution that relates to Kosovo, says that the Security Council remains seized on the matter and that the Secretary General needs to act in an even-handed and unbiased way. So I think that successful Secretary General will have to be even-handed and unbiased in this issue, like in all other issues, if he or she hopes to be successful. That's certainly what I hope to be. When it comes to the biggest challenge, there are many ways in which you can answer this question. One can say that the biggest and the most strategic challenge is climate change, because this is very much about our very existence on the face of this planet. So that's one way of answering your question. Another way of answering your question is the biggest challenge for the UN is to remain relevant in the 21st century. And that, in my opinion, will have to come only through significant, fundamental change and transformation, some of which I was hoping to describe in my platform, so that the UN does not suffer the fate of the League of Nations in between the two world wars, and that more and more countries or regions decide that they should give up on the UN because UN is not there, and we're going to try and deal on our own within regional fora maybe, and not in the UN, which is hopeless. A lot of people are saying we're not even asking where's the UN when you need it. Well, that thing has to change. But in order to do that, one has to give it a very, very significant boost and rejuvenation. That's also one of the biggest threats. And one of the biggest threats is what the question number 3 was about, the geopolitical frictions, and in particular between the world's two foremost nuclear superpowers, United States and the Russian Federation. I can remember better days in Russian-American relations. Some people remember worse days in Russian-American relations, like 60 years ago, 50 to 60 years ago, the Cuban crisis and the like. The Secretary General of the United Nations is not going to be able to dictate to the most powerful country on earth, the United States. It's not going to be able to dictate to the Russian Federation or for China or to anybody for that matter. But Secretary General can add flavor to the overall atmospherics when it comes to the necessity to accelerate attempts at making peace. Secretary General can be more personally present, not necessarily in front of the cameras, but behind the scenes. But for that, Secretary General would have to understand where people come from, why they think the way they think, what's the reason for why they have their differences, to be able to talk to all sides, to be able to bridge the differences. And he would have to have the knowledge to do that and the willingness to do so. I certainly have the willingness. I would like to think about myself that I also have some of the knowledge that is required. But if I get elected, I would certainly be someone who would be more present than what we're having right now.
All right, let's gather 3 more questions. Yes, the young woman in the back. Yeah.
Hi, I want to thank you for coming out. I'm actually from American University. My name is Oksana Rizhuk. I'm on the Model UN team here. And knowing your reformation plan and reaffirming the rise of fourth-generation warfare and insurgency groups, I was wondering what kind of peace stabilization resolutions you wish UN committees like the first and the fourth to address, and how you can advance those resolutions yourself as Secretary General. Thank you.
Okay, and yes, on the right there.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Larry Harris. I'm a Rangel Fellow at the State Department. I just returned from the African Union, and something I heard frequently from their peace and security councils is that they would like greater cooperation with the United Nations. In your capacity as Secretary General, what would you do to lead the UN to have greater cooperation with regional organizations like the African Union in fulfillment of Chapter 8?
And you can just pass the mic right next to you.
Hi, Tony Carroll. I'm a senior associate at the African Studies program at CSIS and an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. My question is a little perhaps different on the role that you foresee of high-level panels. I think it's fair to say that the outcomes of high-level panels appointed in the past have been inconsistent. Some of the standards that have been used, sometimes they've become captive of various points of view or audiences. And I'm wondering if you think there's a role of establishing more independent standards, because their recommendations often come out to be sort of ex cathedra in the sense of being received as perceived wisdom and dogma. And I think often the processes are incomplete, if not imperfect. So I'm wondering if you might be able to put some rigor into these, some of these UN panels and use your office for creating the type of credibility and platforms that these panels can no doubt serve if used correctly.
Okay, great. So the role of high-level panels, say cooperation and peacekeeping operations. Where to begin?
So let me then start from the back. I mean, high-level panels are generally a good thing because you do need to talk to people who know better. And one important thing is to know that you don't know best, which is not everybody has this kind of attitude in my world. I've met so many people who don't. I definitely am aware of the fact that I don't know enough about certain things, and I think that generally speaking, high-level panels are a good thing. But there's been a proliferation of high-level panels. And then you say, like, you point rightly to the inconsistency in standards. So I'd be careful when it comes to creating new high-level panels. I'd be very careful picking the topics for them, and I'd be also very careful selecting the people. But once we agree that the high-level panel is needed, and once we agree that here and here, this guy and that guy, these people are going to be on a panel, then I'd give I'll try and give a pretty rigorous framework for what is the question that I'm asking. And then I would probably try and make an extra effort to make sure that what people present and recommend is actually implemented, at least when it comes to what the Secretary General can do in order to implement it. But yes, and especially when it comes to the private sector and the role of private sector and what the private sector can do in advancing sustainable development goals, for example, or following up on the Paris Climate Agreement, there's going to be a need for external wisdom. And I intend to engage in it and very carefully. For African Union, the question about the African Union, I've attended every single meeting of the African Union since 2007. Visited Africa over 50 times in my life, and I'm a big believer in, first of all, in African future, but also I also think that we're gonna succeed or fail. Our Agenda 2030 and the role of the UN in general, first and foremost in Africa. And therefore I envisage in great detail cooperation with African Union as one of the critical elements of peace and security, as well as fulfilling sustainable development goals as a part of my vision. When I was president of the UN General Assembly, I proposed a resolution on the 50th anniversary of the African Union that actually defined the African Union as the key interlocutor of all things UN in the continent, of all everything that UN is doing in the continent, that the AU, African Union, should be its principal partner. It wasn't an easy resolution to pass. In the end, it was passed unanimously. But especially when it comes to peace and security, there has to be a different kind of engagement between the UN and the African Union, with African Union being more in the lead than it used to be so far. This is not to say that we're abandoning Africa, that we're letting African issues be handled by Africans. But we believe, I personally believe, that Africans perhaps know better what the solutions to African problems are. We need to be behind Africa and we need to be working closely with Africa, but African Union has to take a more decisive lead. And this is what my platform envisages. And going to first committee resolutions and peace stabilization resolutions, I mean, there are so many of them. And a number of them just, go from a year to a year and they just be renewed without much follow-up or without much practically being done. I would try to streamline the procedures. Of course, it's a different organ. It's the General Assembly, it's the member states, and the Secretary General has to be very careful as to not to overstep his or her limits and constraints. The Secretary General cannot impose things on the member states. But some of those resolutions, especially those that relate to disarmament, are something that I tend to take a closer look at than perhaps it was the situation with the Secretariat in the past.
All right, let's do a lightning round. Let's gather 3 more questions very quickly. And yes, right here in the front, please. And then.
Thank you for coming out. So the Security Council in particular has been under a lot of scrutiny lately, especially with the P5 and the relevance of the countries that make it up and how difficult it is to pass certain resolutions. Would you have a call to action to deal with the Security Council and suggest any reforms? And if so, what would those be?
Okay, great. Let's take two more. Yes, there in the back, in the middle, and then here on the right.
Thank you, sir, for joining us today. Very quick question. One of the reforms that we have seen proposed but not implemented yet in this year's selection process has been the call for a single term for the Secretary General. I was wondering if you would accept a single 7-year term if that was the recommendation from the Security Council to the General Assembly.
And then right here, please.
Sir, I'm former Congressman Flanagan, and I've come to visit today. My good friend Tom Creel has done a good amount of work with you. I'm asking about a private sector action in helping with creative ways to fund some of the initiatives that you'd like to see happen, particularly in recovering money lost to corruption or to terrorism or other things, particularly in funding the High Commissioner's role and peacekeeping roles outside of member state solicitations. As a reformer, and that's a charged word, but you really are going to be a reformer of the institution should you be elected, I think you have an opportunity to creatively finance some of these things and solve some of the budget issues that were obviated earlier by the excellent panel that was here.
Okay, great. So private sector action and corruption and so on from Congressman Flanagan, a call for a single term, and then UN Security Council dysfunction and reform.
Without working with the private sector, without making sure that private sector resources are more used in the UN, there's going to be no fulfilling, not just of the 2030 agenda, but of most of the things, humanitarian, disaster relief, and so on and so forth. Today, there are about $80 billion a year in charitable givings. And in the past 10 years, the UN has been able to tap into 1.5 billion out of 80 billion annually. So I think that UN can and should do a much better job. And to that end, I propose a series of measures and appointing a series of special envoys for philanthropic outreach and some other special envoys to make more vibrant and more organic the work of the UN with the private sector. Without that, we're not going to make it. I intend to work far more closely with the private sector than it has been in the past. Having said that, it's a very, very delicate issue politically. A lot of countries feel threatened by what they see as globalist empires, you know, and so it's not an easy thing. And I intend to make sure that their concerns are alleviated and that they do not feel threatened in any way. That particularly applies when it comes to the funding from the private sector of certain offices, including, for example, the Office of Human Rights, Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. I would welcome more private funds there. But I would also have to make sure, and I intend to do so, that there are no strings attached when it comes to private money coming into UN funds. Not an easy thing, but I think it can be done and it can be done right. Now, when it comes to a single term, if I would accept a recommendation, one would have to accept the recommendation of the Security Council and the decision of the General Assembly. And if that is the one single term, then it's going to be the one single term. I understand the logic that a single term makes it for an easier and less constrained Secretary General who would not have to worry about re-election. I understand this logic. It's actually very sound logic, but one would have to follow the recommendation of the Security Council and of the General Assembly. One cannot reinvent or impose his or her will on the member states or the key organs of the United Nations. And talking about the Security Council, not the easiest days in the Security Council. But then again, not the most difficult days in history either. If I remember well, in around about the Cuban crisis, the height of the Cold War, there was one resolution passed in the entire year. We're not there. Thank God we're not there. I'm not saying it's an easy situation, but we're not at that trough, historic trough. The Secretary General can interact and work with the Security Council, and there are even certain articles of the Charter that allow Secretary General to bring things to the attention of the Council. That is Article 99, which is something that is not very often used. The P5 hate it, and but I think the Article 99 is an important tool that Secretary General needs to have at his or her disposal ready. Of course, there are many, many ways in which things can be brought to the attention of the Council, privately or otherwise. So that is not something that I believe should be used very often. But it's important that we know that this is one of the tools that an independent-minded Secretary General can have and is aware of. And when it comes to the Security Council reform, it's a very tricky question, especially for those who hope to get elected Secretary General. And because this is, you know, the P5 have a very special privilege in the Security Council, and including in the election of the Secretary General. But I did say in my hearings, and I did say in the candidates debate, something that I maybe will, in the end, come to regret. But this is my view. This is not a world of 1945. We don't live in 1945. A few things happen in the meantime. And I believe that there can be a better representation, better reflection of the world's realities today than what is, I mean, in comparison to what we have. Then again, it has to be a member states-driven process. This is one of those fundamental privileges of the members and not of the officers of the club. But I said that, and if my successor, because I'm going to get elected, if my successor gets to be elected in exactly the same way and by exactly the same procedure and people, then I will have probably failed in my attempt to reform the United Nations. So I'm sorry that I can't be more specific than that, because believe it or not, I do hope to get elected next month.
All right, well, thank you all so much for coming, and a very special thank you to Mr. Jeremić for submitting to our questions, and especially for being the first, and for your openness in answering our questions.